Is God the author of sin? I mean, if he has predetermined all things, planned all things, decreed all things from the beginning, from the greatest to the least, doesn't that make him the author of sin? This is a valid question and one that I want to answer. It's not going to be answered exhaustively. It's not going to be answered probably even finally, but I do wish to give an answer that I think will be helpful to you. All the confessions, all the creeds, the historic Christian faith has taught that God is not the author of sin. But historic Reformed theology has also declared that God, from the least thing to the greatest thing, has predetermined, planned, and ordained every last thing. But if that's the case, isn't sin included in that? And the answer is yes. So then how is God not the author of sin? Well, first, let me set the scriptures at the center so we can see what it is that we're actually talking about. Because both the Reformed crowd and everyone else who's not Reformed, everyone will say the same thing. Namely, no, God is not the author of sin. We'll all agree to that. What do we mean? Well, what we're trying to do is explain difficult texts, sort of like the one that I'm going to read to you right now. So everyone has to reckon with this scripture. And let me read it and we'll talk about it. Ye men of Israel. Oh, a little bit of context. This is Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter number 2. It's verses 22 and 23. Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, the man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves also know. Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain. So, both the Reformed crowd and the non-Reformed crowd will look at this text and say, God is not the author of sin, and yet they will both read this scripture and approve it as being true. That by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, the determinate counsel, we would point to his God's decree, his blueprint for all of creation, his blueprint for all creation that providence has been in the business of bringing about and fulfilling. God's taken this blueprint and he's created the world and by providence governed it to this laser-focused end, which is the fame of his name, the glory of Jesus Christ. And it's culminating now in the work of Jesus Christ upon the cross for sinners. And now Peter's commenting back upon that and he's saying, you took him. You took Jesus Christ. And by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, you killed him. Moreover, you killed him with wicked hands. So, let me ask you a question. Is God the author of the cross? Did the cross take place by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God? Could God have done otherwise at the cross? Could God have governed and created a world in which the cross did not take place? Everyone would affirm, every Orthodox Christian would affirm, yes. God, it is within the power of God to do whatever he so chooses. God can do all his holy will. Whatever he pleases, he may do. The Reformed crowd goes one step further and says, not only can God do what he pleases, God does as he pleases. But what do we do with this text where it says, by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, you've taken him with wicked hands, have crucified and slain? Did God plan the cross? Yes. Did wicked hands take Jesus Christ and kill him? Yes. Was it the will of God for Jesus Christ to die upon the cross? Yes. Will the men who took Jesus Christ and crucified him, will they be judged for slaying an innocent man, the most perfect man? Will they be judged according to their deeds? Yes. So let's circle back around to the question of, is God the author of sin? What do we mean if we reckon with a text like this, which sort of seems like God is the author of sin, but at the same time we affirm he's not the author of sin? What do we mean? Well, with this introduction out of the way, because really this has just been an introduction, it's a rather long one, I apologize. What do we mean when we say God is not the author of sin? It's simply this: that any sin that's in the world, any lack of goodness which is in the world, isn't a result of a lack of goodness in God. That's what we mean. When we say that God is not the author of sin, what we're doing is we see sin in the world, right? We see all kinds of deficiencies in the world where men have failed to do or to live up to God's righteous requirements, to live according to God's holy, just, and good law. We look all around and we see men doing that. And so we have to ask, well, why is this? Do we have a broken world because we have a broken God? Is there deficiency in the world because there's deficiency in God? And explicitly, all Christians say, no. God is not the author of sin. But we have to explain what we mean by that. We don't mean that God blindly created the world hoping things would work out, but they didn't, and it's not his fault. That's not what we mean when we say God is not the author of sin. When we say that God is not the author of sin, we mean he's not the originator in a very specific sense. God is not the originator of sin in this specific sense. It is not because of a deficiency in God that the creation has fallen. It is not a lack in God that has resulted in a sin-filled world. We don't trace the deficiencies in man to any deficiency in God. That's what we mean when we say God is not the author of sin. Did God write the story of the world before all the world began? Yeah, you better believe he did. But is he the author of sin? No. There's not deficiency in the world because there's deficiency in God. That's what we mean. Because we all affirm that Jesus Christ was slain. He was slain according to the plan of God, meaning, God wrote down a plan, crush the Son of God on behalf of many sinners so that they would come to glory and exalt Jesus Christ for the fame of my name. God didn't write that out. And then now we can call him the author of sin because his plan has sin in it. Here's an illustration that might be helpful, though it has limitations. And it's one that I've ripped off, okay? And I ripped it off from N.D. Wilson. Here's how it goes. When you read Shakespeare, a play of Shakespeare, and let's say it has murder in the play, is the murder in the play a result of Shakespeare's sinfulness? Can Shakespeare write evil into his play without being evil? The answer is yes. Can Shakespeare use evil in his play without being evil? Can Shakespeare, now this is where it's going to get really complicated. Can Shakespeare use evil in his play to good ends? Yeah. But does that make Shakespeare evil? Is he, as an author, evil because he wrote evil into his story? And so I would say the world is God's story spoken into existence by God. And this world that we see has sin in it. It lacks in many ways to live up to God's righteous requirements. But is that because there's a lack in God? And everyone affirms no. So when the confessions of faith affirm God is not the author of sin, when all the historic catechisms affirm God is not the author of sin, as we seek to protect the holiness of God, as we seek to set boundaries of human language and expression that we are not willing to cross, rightly so, and we say God is not the author of sin, what we're affirming is God can use sin and does and has used sin. He's written sin into his story, but he hasn't done so as the root of sin. There's not a root of sin in God that results in a fruit of sin in creation. So in that way, he's not the author of it. Though he has ordained it, though he has purposed to use it and planned to use it and does use it, and thank his glorious name, he has used it. This is why we have hope that he's used sin in the past. Now, and when I talk like that, is the death of Jesus Christ. If we affirm that God is predetermined, planned, according to the counsel of his good will, that wicked hands take and crucify his son, he can do that for his righteous ends and yet be righteous. God can use unrighteousness and still be a righteous God, and he has, and he does. One of the classic examples in this is that of Joseph and his brethren. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, right? And in the end, they're reconciled. I'll skip the story because I want to wrap it up. Okay. Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. In the end, they're all reconciled. And Joseph says these things to his brethren. He says, "You meant it for evil." Now, what's the rest of it? If you said God used it for good, you're wrong. It's not what it says. It doesn't say you meant it for evil and God used it for good. And many evangelifish churches talk like that, and it's wrong. The scriptures say this. This is what Joseph says to his brethren. "You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good to save much people alive." So God wrote in his story, Joseph's brothers betray him. But is that because does that make God the author of sin in the sense that there's deficiency in God and now there's deficiency in Joseph's brothers? No, it doesn't. God had meaning in the brothers' sinful action, and they had meaning in their sinful action. They hated their brother, so they sold him into slavery. God in love to save much people alive, to preserve the seed of Jacob, so that from one day from him could come Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, one of Jacob's sons, to preserve that distinct people alive, to keep his promise alive. He planned for Joseph's brothers to betray him. He planned for a famine to come upon the land. He planned for them to be reunited in Egypt. He planned for them to be there and multiply and to grow. Okay, he meant it for good. One more illustration. A surgeon can take a knife, right? And he can take that knife, plunge it into a man's chest for good. But would I go and give a knife to my daughter and say, "Here, go use this for good"? Would I take my 3-year-old and say, "Here's a scalpel, go do good with it"? No, I wouldn't. That would be absurd. And so, likewise, we don't get to take sin and go out and try and use it for good. But is sin that something in the hands of God is used and meant to bring about good? Yeah, it is. Is God the author of sin? No. Not in the sense that there's deficiency in the world because there's a deficiency in God. That's what we mean when we deny that God is the author of sin. We don't deny and say that sin slipped past his view. snuck into the world when he wasn't watching. So he's not the author of it. We don't affirm something like that. We affirm that God is not the author of sin, in the sense that there's no root of sin in him that results in the fruit of sin in the world. There's no deficiency in him that results in deficiency in the world. That's what we mean when we say that God is not the author of sin. And at the same time, we affirm that all things, from the least to the greatest, he does uphold, govern, direct, and guide according to his good decree, which he established in eternity. If you have more questions now at the end than you did at the beginning, that's okay. It's all right. These things take a long time for people to work through, and hopefully we all still have time to continue to work them out. So if it's hard, if it's difficult, don't be discouraged. Continue to think about these things, search for the truth, and I wish you well as you do so.